Thank you for joining us for the virtual Mindshift conference. Mindshift is an organic, informal, and international network of Christian education leaders working to catalyze innovative change in our schools. We provide forums for like-minded leaders and friends who care about the mission of Christian education to converse, convene, and collaborate. The purpose of this conference is to provide sessions related to the recent book, Mindshift, Catalyzing Change in Christian Education, as well as push beyond the book to invite discussion around pressing or controversial questions facing educators, students, and schools. After watching this keynote video, please make plans to join us later in the month for the corresponding panel discussion as noted on the Mindshift conference schedule.
I'm Kristen Dumais, and I'm excited to be joining you for this event remotely. I'm going to be talking about white evangelicals and our current political moment. And this talk is going to be based largely on the research that I've done for my book, Jesus and John Wayne. So I thought I would start by giving you a little background on that book itself. Although the book comes right up to the present moment, the research for the book actually started some 15 years ago. And I did not set out to write a book about John Wayne, and I certainly did not know that the book would culminate in the election of Donald Trump. But it was back in maybe 2005, 2006 that I was teaching a course in U.S. history at Calvin University. And I was teaching a class on Teddy Roosevelt. And I wanted to show my students how ideas about gender, ideas of masculinity were linked to broader issues, to economic changes, to religious transformations, and also to issues of war and foreign policy. And Teddy Roosevelt is just this classic example. And after that class period, a couple of guys came up to me and said, Professor Dumais, there's this book that you really need to read. And this was the book, John Eldredge's Wild at Heart. So when students tell me I need to read something, I do, and immediately I saw what they were talking about. Eldredge opens his book with a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, and he goes on to present this vision of Christian manhood that is eerily reminiscent of the kind of muscular Christianity that people like Roosevelt were touting in the early 20th century. And as I had taught them in the class, these ideas of masculinity and even Christian manhood could have some very real repercussions in terms of empire, in terms of militarism and war. And at that time, Wild at Heart was wildly popular in Christian circles, particularly white evangelical circles. And some of you may have experienced that yourself. It seemed like every college dorm room was having book studies, church small groups. The book ended up selling more than 4 million copies. So extremely influential. And then it wasn't just this book, but the success of this book kind of spawned a cottage industry of copycat books, so that there were soon dozens, if not hundreds of titles, books on Christian manhood, Christian masculinity that were promoting a really kind of militant, militaristic model. For Eldredge, God was a warrior God and men were made in his image. And every man needed a battle to fight and a beauty to rescue. And so as a historian who is trained in the study of gender and trained to see connections between gender and other things that were going on, I started to pay attention to survey data that was coming out at that time. This was the time of the Iraq War. And what we saw was that white evangelicals were disproportionately more supportive of the war than any other Americans, supportive of preemptive war generally. They were much more likely to condone the use of torture than other Americans were and to embrace an aggressive foreign policy. And so I started to wonder how these ideas of militant Christian manhood might be linked to other forms of militancy and militarism. That was back in 2005 and 2006. I really dug into the topic for a time. I had a wonderful research assistant who himself was in the military who helped me kind of launch this project. I gave a couple of talks at that time, but then I decided to set the book aside, at least the research. I did so for a couple of reasons. One, I was incredibly disturbed by what I was uncovering. I was extremely troubled. And related to that, I wasn't sure how mainstream this was. And so I was wondering, am I really kind of focusing in on a fringe movement? And as a person of faith myself, I wondered, am I going to be shining this bright light on the dark underbelly of American Christianity? And is that really what I ought to be doing? Is that what I want to be doing? And so I hadn't really resolved these questions. I just decided to set it aside for a time. I had another book to finish. I had a couple of kids in the meantime. I was busy teaching, and I always meant to return to the project at some point. I want to quick say that, this thought of, as a person of faith myself, as a professing Christian, this instinct to kind of protect Christianity and Christian witness might sound really noble. And I thought it was a noble thing at the time. I thought it was showing this scholarly restraint. To be honest, I'm really troubled by that instinct now. And it's something that I've had to reflect on. Fast forward to the fall of 2016. I was at the time working on a different project. I was exploring the religious formation of Hillary Clinton based on my earlier work on the history of progressive Methodist women and Christian feminism. But I was watching from that vantage point the primaries and then the presidential election. And it was almost exactly 4 years ago, with the release of the Access Hollywood tapes, that things clicked for me. If you recall, at that point, we had irrefutable evidence of Donald Trump speaking on camera about sexually assaulting women. We had already seen by that time that white evangelicals had flocked to his campaign, and they were going to be critical to any victory. And then everybody kind of stopped and watched. And everybody was asking, how can family values evangelicals support this guy? Surely this is going to be the last straw. And we saw a few prominent evangelicals waver ever so briefly, but within a week or two, they were all back behind Trump, all those who had been at that point, really. And that's when this really clicked for me. We've seen this before. I pulled up some of my old research, and I decided to start looking at this all a little bit more closely, particularly after the election, where we had that kind of shocking number of 81% of white evangelicals, according to exit polls, had ended up supporting Donald Trump, despite everything. And what I realized from my earlier research on Christian manhood and this increasingly militant ideal was that what we were seeing was not ultimately a betrayal of evangelical values, although certain values had been betrayed. But at its core, family values evangelicalism had long kind of propped up this ideal, not just of patriarchy, but also of an aggressive, militant Christian masculinity that was part of that patriarchal leadership. The idea that God had filled men with testosterone, had created men to be aggressive, to be strong, to be militant, in order to equip them for their patriarchal leadership. And I knew that this went back further than John Eldredge's Wild at Heart, that I had to go deep into the history of white evangelicalism. And so I decided to write a book. First, I decided to research the book. And I had a couple of kind of challenges right off the start. One of the first dilemmas that I ended up struggling with was, who are white evangelicals? who are evangelicals, more broadly speaking? How do we define evangelicalism? And initially, I had intended to do what most scholars of evangelicalism had been doing up to that point, and that was to use this really handy definition that was kind of out there. A British historian David Bebbington had come up with it. History nerds know that, and theology nerds know it as the Bebbington quadrilateral, meaning a kind of 4-point definition of what it means to be an evangelical, kind of rubric. So evangelicals uphold the authority of the scriptures, right? They're Bible believing. They believe in conversion experience, the born again experience, and they are activists. And so you kind of go through, so they're acting out of their faith. You go through this list and you check a box, and there you have it. An evangelical. And this is what the National Association of Evangelicals has on their website. But as I continued to research, I realized that definition wasn't very helpful for the research that I was doing. It seemed to me that many people who could check those boxes didn't, in fact, identify as evangelicals, and that there was something more to evangelicalism itself. There was a cultural identity. There was a historical tradition that a kind of static rubric set of boxes that you check or don't check wasn't able to kind of capture. And you can really see this when it comes to questions of race and nation. So if you're just using a little kind of checklist, theological rubric, then you can find a lot of, in fact, the vast majority of Black Protestants in the United States would qualify as evangelicals. And the majority of global Christians would also, especially our global Protestants, would qualify as evangelicals, which is fine if you want to look at kind of commonalities and if you wanted to use a rubric like that. But when it comes to really understanding the 81%, understanding evangelicalism and the relationship between evangelicalism and politics and culture today, that's where I think we need to refine our understanding. And we need race to be a part of that identity because, in fact, in terms of lived experience, in terms of going to church, forming churches, living in community, Black Protestants and white evangelicals are largely separate in terms of their history, in terms of their political values, in terms of how they understand their theology, how they understand who Jesus was, how they understand how their faith leads to activism. These things are dramatically different. And so I thought it was important to study white evangelicalism as its own distinctive religious movement. That's not entirely disconnected from Black Protestantism or from mainline Christianity or from other movements, but it needs to be examined in its own light and then those connections explored. So the definition of evangelicalism for me had to embrace not just theology or stated beliefs, because in truth, the evangelicals that I'd been meeting were often alarmingly theologically illiterate. And in fact, survey data suggests that many evangelicals hold views that technically would qualify them as heretics. That theology, narrowly understood, really isn't all that operative for many evangelicals. And so if not theology or doctrine, then what does it mean to be an evangelical? And looking around me, looking at evangelical communities, looking at evangelical churches, looking at my own evangelical students who are coming into my classroom, I came to see that there was a popular culture, a culture of consumption that really had formed the faith of so many white evangelicals. And by culture of consumption, I just mean the things people bought, the media they consumed, the radio they've listened to and have grown up listened to, Christian contemporary music, James Dobson's Focus on the Family, the Christian publishing industry, right? All of these small groups and Bible studies and materials that that their pastors would read and recommend. And then there's these websites and organizations like the Council on Biblical Manhood and the Gospel Coalition, and John Piper's Little Kingdom, and that all of these things are really important to understanding the religious formation of American evangelicals, much more than maybe what happens inside the walls of a seminary. Although, bring in the Southern Baptist Convention and different seminaries, and they're part of the story too. But I came to understand evangelicalism more as this consumer culture and as a network of alliances, very complicated. At one point, I had three amazing research assistants helping me on this project, and we had three huge pieces of butcher paper on my office wall with sticky notes covering and Sharpies literally connecting the dots to see which organization was connected to which other organization, who was promoting whose work, who was blurbing whose books, and who was sharing their platform and amplifying whose ideas. So this network of understanding evangelicalism as a series of alliances. And there's no one leader. But there are boundaries to the movement, and those boundaries are reinforced by the individuals and organizations that make up this network. So if you cross a line, and which lines you can cross are very interesting and shift a little bit over time, but if you cross particular lines, such as on LGBTQ issues, or in some cases on gender, complementarianism, patriarchy, you can very quickly find yourself outside of evangelicalism. Now, that doesn't mean that you necessarily can't go to an evangelical church, although it might mean that you're asked to leave your church. Certainly, if you're a pastor, you can find that you're asked to leave your church. But it also means, in terms of this consumer culture, in terms of this culture of evangelicalism, popular culture, that your books are no longer going to be sold at Christian bookstores, that certain publishers will no longer publish you. These distribution networks that are so critical to the project of cultural evangelicalism can be closed off to you. And people like Jen Hatmaker and Rachel Held Evans can attest to the power of this kind of exclusion. So that was one of the discoveries that I made early on, that I needed to think about evangelicalism in different ways than previous scholars have done, in ways that I think map more closely onto the actual experience of evangelicals themselves. The other dilemma I faced when starting my book project was a problem common to historians. It's, where do you start this story? I knew that the story would really pick up in the 1970s with the rise of the religious right, but I also knew I needed to go back further, at least the 1940s. Then I ended up taking a quick glance back to the 19th century. And I wanted to do so for a couple of reasons. One, I really needed to make clear that things have not always been the way they are now. There has been change over time, and this is really key to any historical study. And once we understand that things used to look differently, then we can become a lot more curious about the way they look now, how this came to be, who was making these choices, for what purposes. And so that was important. And for me, especially with respect to ideas of masculinity, of Christian manhood. Because within Christian circles, at any given moment, you're likely to hear teachings about Christian masculinity and femininity and God-ordained gender roles as static constructs, right? Throughout all of history, from the beginning of time, God has mandated, fill in the blank, that Christian men should do this or should be that. As a historian, if you look even to the recent past, you're going to find very different conceptions of what it meant to be a Christian man, what it meant to be a Christian woman. And these are often contingent, are always contingent on other things that are happening, on economic arrangements, on what else is happening in the nation, on class, social class, regional differences. So I wanted to look back very briefly to the 19th century. And there we see various ideas of Christian masculinity. One common idea within Victorian Christianity was that a Christian man ought to exhibit restraint. Self-restraint was a kind of model of Christian masculinity, this kind of gentlemanly manhood. There was, however, a conflicting model, particularly within the American South. It wasn't absolutely conflicting, but a kind of different variation. Within the American South, evangelicalism had come in earlier and had really initially challenged social hierarchies, class and racial hierarchies, because within evangelicalism, there is this kind of egalitarian spirit, right? That we are all receiving the Holy Spirit. We can all respond to God. And so there can be a kind of leveling effect. And you saw that initially when evangelical revivals were held throughout the South. Before long, however, the kind of dominant powers ended up creating a different kind of evangelicalism, one that reinforced the social hierarchies, and one that especially reinforced patriarchal authority. And so there's this new idea of Christian manhood where the Christian patriarch, the white Christian patriarch, was given the responsibility to protect his dependents, to protect his wife and children and enslaved people, and that violence was sometimes necessary in order to protect and preserve order. And so you see already competing understandings of what it means to be a Christian man. By the early 20th century, we see within the North, and more broadly, ideas of this older model of gentlemanly restraint kind of fell out of fashion. Times had changed, new challenges presented themselves, and that gets us to this era of Teddy Roosevelt and muscular Christianity. And that actually unifies ideals of the North and the South at this time, a kind of embrace of potentially militant, militaristic models of manhood. Violence might be necessary. Then we have the First World War, but again, things are a little surprising there. You do have some conservative Protestants who embrace this muscular Christianity and go off and promote the war. But you also have a lot of progressive or liberal Protestants who have also embraced muscular Christianity. It was not just a conservative thing. And even more than conservatives, they embraced the war and militarism. Some conservatives at the time were still separatists, and they did not believe that America was a Christian nation and that it needed to be defended as such. And they were actually, many were pacifists. That ends up changing with the outcome of the war for a variety of different reasons. And fast forward again to the Second World War, and this is where we see the scripts kind of flip. This is where we see conservative Protestants, conservative evangelicals coming out strongly supporting the war effort. Christian nationalism seems to really be motivating folks. And this is right at the time that evangelicals are attempting to kind of reclaim their status in broader American society. They had felt marginalized by the fundamentalist modernist controversies. They felt they had lost their standing. And so they wanted to reassert themselves. Billy Graham is right at the center of this. They know that they have to work through the media, through popular media to do this. And they really want to kind of reclaim America. And it's at this moment that we see this kind of Christian nationalism coming together with gender traditionalism within evangelical circles. World War II kind of starts this up, but the Cold War really solidifies this. Cold War, by the late 1940s, we see evangelicals embracing Cold War militarism. For them, it's an easy question. Communism seems to be this dire threat to America, to the American family, and to American Christianity, to God himself. And so the obvious response seems to be a strong military, an aggressive military to defend Christian values, defend Christian America, defend their own families. For a while, they're in line with what many other Americans are thinking at the time. This is the time of the baby boom. We have a Cold War consensus. And so they do find themselves close to the centers of American power. And again, Billy Graham helps facilitate this. In the 1960s, this really starts to fall apart. And between the civil rights movement and feminism and the anti-war movement, evangelicals are feeling increasingly marginalized. White evangelicals are. And each of these movements, in different ways, ends up undermining white patriarchal authority. And so Vietnam is this crisis for white evangelicals in particular. And that's where you can really see concerns about masculinity coming to the fore. The idea that American men were not strong enough to do their job, to defend Christian America on foreign battlefields. The problem must be masculinity itself. And so they can blame feminists, they can blame liberal culture, secular humanism. And you see evangelicals writing about gender a lot at this time, about gender difference and about we need proper femininity, meaning delicate, weak, submissive femininity, but beautiful and sweet and alluring. And we need proper manhood. And by that, they meant strong men, men who could fight on the battlefields of Vietnam, men who were not cowed by feminism or effeminacy. And they were afraid from what they saw happening around them that it was going to be up to evangelicals to really create the kind of men that the nation needed. And people like James Dobson are writing this sort of thing, but he's not the only one. Jack Hyles and the Independent Fundamental Baptist Network is one of the early proponents of this, but very quickly it just kind of becomes common knowledge within white evangelical circles. And so many books are published on child rearing, how to raise boys, how to raise girls, and to do so in opposition to what's happening elsewhere in America. So in the book, Jesus and John Wayne, I then trace over the decades the evolution of this kind of militant conception of Christian manhood. It kind of ebbs and flows with respect to what else is happening in the 1990s. We kind of have a kinder, gentler version. The Cold War has ended. The Promise Keepers movement even plays with some egalitarian themes. By the end of the 1990s, though, we see a kind of reversion, a backlash against the soft patriarchy, the kind of servant leadership, the tender warrior motif from the Promise Keepers movement. And so by the late 1990s, we see a kind of return to, no, that's not what America needs right now. We need to return to a rugged conception of masculinity. Things had gotten too soft. And in 2001, that's when we see Eldridge's Wild at Heart published, James Dobson's Bringing Up Boys, Doug Wilson's Future Men, and all of these books present a much more militant model, testosterone-driven model of aggressive Christian manhood. These books are on the shelves when terrorists attacked the United States on September 11, 2001. They're newly on the shelves, lining Christian bookstores. And this is a catalyzing moment that many evangelicals, many American Christians, many Americans themselves, religious or not, are in shock and are drawn to a renewed militarism. And for Christians, a renewed Christian militarism. When the nation was under attack, we needed strong men, soldiers, firemen to save the American people, to save the American nation. And so in the early 2000s, we see this kind of muscular Christianity 2.0 on steroids. This is where we have Mark Driscoll, Doug Wilson becomes more popular and more mainstream, and we see this really spread on this militant conception of masculinity and a hypersexualized understanding of femininity, which is its counterpart, really sweep across American evangelicalism, the Southern Baptist Convention, Young, Restless, and Reformed movement, homeschool movement. You can find like echoes of this or articulations of this across this network that is American evangelicalism, and you find it permeating evangelical popular culture. And you see political expressions of this, not just support for George W. Bush, support for war, for the military. You also see strong rise of Islamophobia within white evangelical circles. Many of the very same people that are promoting this militant masculinity are also promoting Islamophobia in very clear ways. And so you see that taking hold even more strongly within evangelical circles. And also during this time, although I had set the research aside, I kept an eye on some of my main characters, some of the key proponents of this very militant Christian manhood. And what I saw was that one after another of these men became implicated directly or indirectly in sexual abuse scandals or abuses of power in their own churches and organizations and even their own families. And so I kept a record of that. We have the presidency of Barack Hussein Obama, which just accelerates this kind of backlash, accelerates the sense of urgency, of crisis, that white evangelicals, conservative white evangelicals, are losing their hold on the nation. We have demographic changes. You have the sea change on LGBTQ rights. And so this growing sense of anxiety, of fear of losing power, of losing control. Religious freedom is also an issue that really strikes at the heart of white evangelicals. If they think they are losing control of the culture, then their religious liberty, their freedom to practice their faith as they see fit, is all the more important. And that brings us up to 2016, when evangelicals are looking around for a strong man to defend them and their interests and their power in this critical moment. And they find what they are looking for in Donald Trump. Many observers initially said, these guys are hypocrites or they're betraying their values. How could family values evangelicals embrace a man like Donald Trump? But to suggest that this is mere hypocrisy or that this is a betrayal of values ignores the fact that for white evangelicals, this kind of militant Christian masculinity had always been a part of family values evangelicalism. This idea that our leaders needed to be strong, needed to be aggressive, needed to resort to violence when necessary, and the ends would justify the means in order to protect their families, their churches, and their nation. And when that came together, when that clicked for me, I began to see it everywhere, right? I began to see Trump's evangelical supporters, people like Robert Jeffress, say this very plainly, that we need the meanest, toughest son of a you-know-what, and that's where evangelicals are right now, and Trump was their man. What I had also seen in my research was that I needed to rethink the relationship between fear and militarism. Because again, kind of conventional narrative suggested that evangelicals were drawn to Trump as a strong man because they were so afraid, right? They were afraid of losing their privileges. They were afraid of their religious liberty being taken away. They were afraid of being marginalized. They were afraid of being persecuted. And that is true on an individual level. Many evangelicals were deeply afraid. What I did also see through my historical research was that evangelical fears have very frequently been stoked by evangelical leaders themselves. People like Jerry Falwell Sr., people like Mark Driscoll, the organizations within the religious right had long resorted to fear tactics, to stoking fears in the hearts of their followers in order to drive donations, in order to consolidate their own power, because then they could step in after stoking these fears and say, we will protect you. I will protect you, but you have to submit to my authority, to my power. And that this was a pattern that we saw repeated over decades within evangelical communities. And it was a relationship that produced a number of tragic situations, abuses of power, again, sexual abuses, a real kind of toxic brew across the decades within white evangelicalism, so that bringing us up to 2016 and what has happened since, again, there are very few surprises here if we have an understanding of this history. So that's the history that I write about in this book, Jesus and John Wayne. And that explains the subtitle also, which is a little harsh, perhaps, how white evangelicals corrupted a faith and fractured a nation. By corrupted, what I'm referring to is very explicit cases where traditional teachings of loving your neighbor as yourself, of loving your enemies, of turning the other cheek, the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control, all of these things, they were explicitly rejected. These things are emasculating. That's not what we need in this moment. As a person of faith myself, that's the corruption of the faith that I'm talking about. And I do believe that it has, in effect, fractured our nation. This militancy has relied on an us versus them mentality of not seeing others as our neighbors, to be treated with hospitality, of not encouraging an embrace of the common good. Instead, it's drawing sides, because this militancy always requires a battle to fight. Proper Christian manhood always requires a battle to fight. And to me, at least, that did seem to be a corruption of biblical Christianity as I understood it, and certainly the gospel message, where Christ divests himself of power, offers himself as a sacrifice. So the book published this summer, and I have to say that the way the book has been received has been surprising, astonishing in some ways. That some of the book's biggest fans are white evangelicals themselves and many white evangelical men. Since this book has published, I have received countless letters. Someday I'll try to count them. I'm guessing around 200 now, from evangelicals who lived and breathed this ideology. And they are writing me saying, this is the story of my life. One writer put it this way: I bumped into so many of these trees, but I never saw the forest. I never saw how all of this fit together. I participated in these. So Jesus and John Wayne is a popular history. It's a cultural history. It's about the lives of ordinary evangelicals. What influenced them? What formed their faith at critical times over the last few centuries or last few decades? And so it's a story where many people just recognize themselves, recognize their own story as part of the story. But what has amazed me was how many people who have been deeply embedded in these organizations, in these institutions, in these churches, pastors, leaders, and just people in the pews have said, this is the story of my life, and I am not okay with this. And this is not what I want, and this is not what I think biblical Christianity teaches. Many of these people also find it difficult to speak out. Pastors confess to fearing that they will lose their positions. People in organizations worry that they can't speak out. And so the power dynamics within this network continue to work against having Christians speak their truth and speak courageously. And that's what it will take at this moment. It will take all kinds of individual acts of courage and then communal acts of courage, I think, to rethink evangelicalism today, to rethink American Christianity, to rethink what it means to be a Christian in our present historical and cultural and political moment. And that's what I hope that Jesus and John Wayne can help us do. One small piece in helping us rethink where we are and then work together as a community to think about where we want to be.